All right, good to see everybody. Open your Bibles, if you would, to 2 Chronicles 36. 2 Chronicles 36. We're going to Lamentations. Don't worry. We're going to spend plenty of time in Lamentations. There's a little girl in Alabama. That's what she kept calling it one day. She said, "Mr. Ben, are you teaching on Lamentations?" I said, "Yeah, that's fine. If you want to say that, that's fine." I have a handout for you, but I'm going to give that to you after class tonight. This handout is exactly what we're going through in my notes. So these are, this handout is what I'm following, but I want to do something a little different. I don't want to give that to you ahead of time, okay? So, as we prepare to begin, I want you all to help me teach the class tonight. And the way you're going to do that is by reading some selected scriptures for me. Is there anybody who just is extremely uncomfortable with reading out loud? You do not want to do it. Oh, okay. No problem. All right. Okay. All right. Then, if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is go around and just give everybody, with two exceptions, a passage to read, and we'll make our way through, so that way we're not all having to turn back and forth. What I'd like for you to do as others are reading is just listen, and just listen carefully to what is said. So we'll start in 2 Chronicles 36. Yes, 2 Chronicles 36. All right. Every 7 years, the priests of Israel were to read the book of the law to the people. That in itself is astounding. Only every 7 years. But this was their task. Read the law to the people. And the things that the law says that were stated in warnings, like the curses from Deuteronomy and Leviticus, that should have been a warning to the people that they should follow God's laws. But, verse 14, 2 Chronicles 36, all the officials of the priests and the people were very unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. They defiled the house of the Lord, which he had sanctified in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand. When this happened and Jerusalem fell, it was a time of unimaginable pain and suffering and horror. And the book of Lamentations depicts that for us. So let's go to Lamentations together. We're going to spend all of our time in this amazingly depressing book. But a couple things that are of interest about the book of Lamentations. First, Lamentations is a poem. It's actually 5 distinct poems. And you'll notice that each chapter, save chapter 3, has 22 verses in it. Chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5 have 22 verses. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters. And so in those 4 chapters, each verse begins with each successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's actually a really beautiful thing to see in Hebrew. You see that pattern and that poetic structure. Why then does chapter 3 not have 22 verses? It has 66. Chapter 3 gives 3 verses per letter. 22 times 3, 66. Okay? All right. So, there are some different ways that commentators suggest we view the book of Lamentations. Like each poem, each of the 5 poems has its own distinct purpose, and there's some truth to that, but there is a lot of overlap in this as well. What we're going to do tonight is just kind of survey the whole book. We're going to jump around a lot. We're going to be flipping back chapter 1, chapter 5, chapter 3, chapter 2. We'll go back and forth a lot, okay? And I want you all to help me. Now, some of you came in after I asked, is there anybody who is afraid to read out loud? You just don't want to read in public. Anybody afraid of doing that aside from those who have already answered? Great. Okay, good. So, here's what we're going to do. Sandy. Chapter 5. All right. Chapter 1. All right. Zach, chapter 5. Thank you, Stephanie. Zach, chapter 5. Alan, chapter 4. All right. And when I get to the end of those verses, I'll bring in some new recruits. Okay. So, first, Lamentations talks about the horrors of Jerusalem's destruction. It talks about the extreme violence and death that was experienced at the hands of the Babylonians. Sandy, would you read, nice, godlike voice, verses 11 and 12? Everybody, I don't want you flipping back and forth. I'm trying to make this easy. Just listen as she reads this.
They ravished the women in Zion, the maidens in the cities of Judah. Princes were hung by their hands, and elders were not respected.
All right. Stephanie, I told you to go to chapter 1, right? All right, read verse 20, please.
Lord, see how I am in distress. I am churning within. My heart is broken, for I have been very rebellious. Outside, the sword takes the children. Inside, there is death.
Outside, the sword takes the children. In the house, there is death. All right? Thousands of God's people were taken away into captivity. Zach, would you read verse 5, please?
We are closely pursued, we are tired, and no one offers us rest.
Is that it? Of your verse 5?
Yes.
That's it? Interesting. Okay. Well, my verse 5 is a little bit longer than that. And at the end of it, it says, her little ones have gone away as captives before the adversary. Little ones, even children, were taken away as captives. Stephanie, chapter 5 again, verses 2 and 3. Oh, you guys have a phone. Okay, no wonder. Okay, that's difficult. All right, don't do that. I'll help you. All right, chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. Talking about the captivity here, okay? We have become orphans without a father. Our mothers are like widows, all right? Because of those who have been taken away into captivity, we are like orphans and we have no father. In the city, people became so desperate for survival that they even resorted to cannibalism. Alan, can you read chapter 4 and verse 10, please?
The hands of the compassionate woman have cooked their own children. They became food for them in the destruction of the daughter of my people.
Can you imagine? Eating your own child. Now, presumably you would have waited right until the child died. You know, you don't kill them to eat them, but I mean, when there's pestilence and disease and famine, who would most likely be the first ones to die? It would be the old, the infirm, and the young. So when the child died, cook them. Wow, terrible. We get these very vivid pictures of the suffering of the people in the aftermath of the invasion. Chapter 5 and verse 2, our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our houses have been given to aliens. People from another land have come and taken our things. We don't have any possessions anymore. Chapter 1 and verse 1, the glory of the city has been taken away. How lonely sits the city that was once full of people. She has become like a widow who was once great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a forced laborer. Verse 6, all her majesty has departed from the daughter of Zion. All right, let me come over to this section now. Celeste, chapter 5. Mary Gail, chapter 1. Alan, I'm sorry, I skipped right over you, Diana. Okay, I'm sorry. You go to chapter 1. All right, Mary Gail, chapter 4. Alan, you also go to chapter 5, please. Okay? All right. What's happened to the temple? It's been reduced to rubble. All of the holy days and everything have, of course, ended because of the destruction. Chapter 1, Celeste, and verse 10, please.
Our skin has become as hot as an oven because of the burning heat of famine.
Chapter 1, verse 10. Did I say 5? Who did I tell 1?
You told me 5. Well,
You, Diane. Okay, you. All right, I'm sorry. Chapter 1 and verse 10. Y'all got to call these things out and tell me. I can't keep all of y'all straight.
If you read it yourself, you wouldn't have this problem.
That's true. That's true. I was trying to solicit some interaction. All right. Chapter 1, Diane, and verse 10.
The adversary has spread his hand over all her pleasant things, for she has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you commanded not to enter your assembly.
Who was commanded not to ever go into the temple? Gentiles, right? And look, they've overrun. They've taken over the place. Chapter 1 and verse 4. Diane, please.
The road to Zion mourn because no one comes to the set feast. All her gates are desolate. Her priests sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness.
All right. Who did I give chapter 4 to? Mary Gail? All right. Chapter 4 and verse 2.
The precious sons of Zion, valuable as fine gold, how they are regarded as clay pots, the work of the hands of the potter.
All right. So the remaining inhabitants of the city, who once were valuable, strong, men, have been reduced to just clay, earthen jars. They have no value. They're worthless now. The people left in the land are on the verge of starvation. Mary Gail, verses 7 through 9, please.
Her Nazarites were brighter than snow and whiter than milk. They were more ruddy in body than rubies, like sapphire in their appearance. Now their appearance is blacker than soot. They go unrecognized in the streets. Their skin clings to their bones. It has become dry as wood. Those slain by the sword are better off than those who die of hunger, for these pine away, stricken for lack of the fruits of the field.
All right. Do you hear the poetry of it? One thing. You listen to the language of it. The way that these things are said. The appearance is blacker than soot. They're unrecognizable. The skin is shriveled on their bones. It's still hard to read, but it's a more poetic way than just saying everybody's really hungry. There's no food to eat. But this is how bad things have become after this devastation. When the Babylonians come through and they don't just knock all the buildings over, they burn the place to the ground, including all the fields and the farms and everything. So there's nothing left. Chapter 1 and verse 11. All the people groan, seeking bread. They've given their precious things for food to restore their lives themselves. They're selling their livelihoods. They're selling their necessities just to get bread to eat. Alan, you going to make a comment? Thought your hand was up. Yeah, okay, I'm coming to you next. Yeah, chapter 5 and verse 4.
Okay. We have drunken our water for money. Our wood is sold unto us.
All right, and now verse 9.
We get our bread with the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness.
All right. Now, I want you to imagine being a child. Being a parent of a child in this circumstance. There's no food. It's hard to find water. And you have young children who are coming to you begging you for food and drink. What would that do to your spirit? Wouldn't you just feel terrible? You're not able to provide for the needs of your family? Celeste, I think I gave you chapter 5, but I want to give you chapter 4. And I want you to read this, because I just gave Alan chapter 5. So, Celeste, chapter 4, verses 3 and 4.
but the daughter of my people has become cruel, like ostriches in the wilderness. The tongue of the infant cleaves to the roof of its mouth because of thirst. The little ones ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them.
This is a poetic way of saying even animals, instinctively know to take care of their children. Animals offer the breast to their young, but the daughters of Jerusalem, the mothers they've become cruel. They've lost the will to take care of their children. They're so exasperated because there's nothing available. It's not that they don't want to, but they've tried to no avail. And at some point you throw your hands up and you say, I quit. In chapter 2 and verse 12, the children are saying to their mothers, "Where is grain and wine?" as they faint like a wounded man in the streets of the city, as their life is poured out on their mother's bosom. Alan, chapter 5 and verse 8.
Servants have ruled over us. There is none that doth deliver us out of their hand.
All right, and now verse 13.
They took the young men to grind, and the children fell under the wood.
All right, they live under oppression now. Everything's been turned upside down. They are dealing with the mockings and the derision of the enemies around them. Tim, chapter 2. Brittany, chapter 1. And Jody, chapter 4. All right, Tim, read verses 15 and 16, please.
All who pass along the way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their heads at the daughters of Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty, the joy of the earth? And your enemies rail against you. They hiss, they gash their teeth, they cry. We have swallowed her. Ah, this is the day we longed for. Now we have it. We see it.
The city has been reduced to nothing, and when people pass by, they see what's become of it, and they say, wow, thought this was a great city. Man, this was a tourist destination for a long time, and we don't want anything to do with this place now. There is no one to bring any comfort to the people who are left in the city. Brittany, I give you chapter 1, yes? Chapter 1 and verse 2, please.
She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her, and they have become her enemies.
All right. She, the city, weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks. She has no one to comfort her among all of her lovers. What do you think that's referring to? Who are the lovers that are not comforting her?
Those that they had alliances with?
All right, good. Those that she was dependent upon, maybe Egypt or some other nation that they might try to form an alliance against Babylon with. Where are they? Right? They're not around. They've been destroyed too. Christine?
As we're reading this, I have not watched the news in a long time, but maybe a month or so.
That's why you smile all the time.
Yes. I saw a clip about Russia and Ukraine. And this is reminding me very much of Ukraine, that Russia has completely, like I said,
leveled.
In a lot. But, they're hiding out, they're going out one time to go get what little water is available, and you have 3-4 generations living underground in for weeks, months on end, just surviving.
Right.
That is kind of,
That's probably the only thing in our current real world experience that we could compare it to. Yes.
I mean, they're living in the city, but they're not surviving.
Right. Yeah, good point. All of these passages just display this horrific experience that the people of Jerusalem and the people of Judah went through. But the question, of course, is why? And we know the answer to that. We read that a moment ago from 2 Chronicles 36. Time after time, God sent prophet after prophet. They didn't listen. And finally, this judgment is what had to come. In chapter 1 and verse 5, her adversaries have become her masters. Her enemies are prospering because the Lord has caused her grief because of the multitude of her transgressions. Where did the judgment come from? Well, it came from Babylon. Yes, but ultimately it came from God. The Lord has caused her grief because of her transgressions. Chapter 4 and verse 6, the iniquity of my people is greater than the sin of Sodom. That's quite a statement. And yet God, maybe a little bit of hyperbole, maybe, but maybe not, right? They were wicked as well. Chapter 1 and verse 20, the city speaking says, my heart is overturned within me, for I have been very rebellious. A judgment like this leaves no alternative but for the people to open their eyes and say, we've been wrong. We have turned away from God and we are getting our just punishment. Chapter 1 and verse 18, the city will confess, the Lord is righteous, for I have rebelled against His command. But Lamentations also says there are other things besides just their sins that led to these conditions. Kyle, I'm going to have you do chapter 2. Jody, I didn't get you yet, did I? What did I give you a minute ago? Chapter 4, right? Okay. All right. Kyle, chapter 2. Jody, chapter 4. One of the things that also led to these conditions is the fact that she, Jerusalem, listened to the wrong teachers. All right? Chapter 2, Kyle, verse 14.
Your prophets have seen for you worthless and deceptive visions, and they have not exposed your wrongdoing so as to restore you from captivity, but they have seen for you worthless and misleading pronouncements.
All right. You've been listening to these false prophets that we talked about. And their falsehood in their teaching could have been known by just looking at the way they were living. And we talked about that in the last couple of lessons. Jody, look at chapter 4 and verse 12 and 13, please.
The kings of the earth did not believe, nor any of the inhabitants of the world, that foe or enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. This was for the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed in the midst of her the blood of the righteous.
Nobody can take Jerusalem. Isn't that what the prophet said? Right? We got the walls, they're built, the temple still stands, everything's fine. And yet, because of the lies of the prophets and the sins of the priests, this has happened. She listened to the wrong teachers. She trusted in the wrong people. Jerusalem trusted in the wrong people. Chapter 4, Jody, in verse 20.
The breath of her nostrils, the Lord's anointed, was captured in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations.
Hey, a son of David is on the throne, just like God promised. Remember talking about the pillars, right? The 4 pillars? We have a son of David on the throne. We're good. We can put our trust and our hope in Him and in the promise that God has given. They trusted in their alliances with foreign nations. We talked about those lovers from chapter 1 and verse 2 already, who are now not there to give any comfort. All of this has come from the hand of the Lord. Now, let's go to chapter 3. And I'm going to take chapter 3 and let's talk about Jeremiah and his specific perspective on this. Notice in chapter 3 and verse 1 how this poem begins. I am the man who has seen affliction. All right, so Jeremiah is writing in the first person in this chapter, talking about his experience, what he saw, what he endured as Babylon came in. So, he suffered much, just like everybody else in the city did. He didn't escape this punishment. Not that he personally was guilty and deserving of the punishment, but his people were suffering and he was there to experience it as well. So, he says, I am the man who has seen affliction. He mentions in verse 2 that he feels like he's constantly walking in the darkness. In verse 3, he feels like he is receiving constant blows from the Lord. He says in verse 6, dark places God has made me to dwell like those who have been long dead. I mean, that tells you where his spirit is, just how he feels because of everything that's happened. In verse 7, He, God, the Lord, has walled me in so that I cannot go out. He's made my chain heavy. He feels trapped and there's no way of escape. He feels like in verse 8 that God is not answering his prayers. In verses 14 and 15, he says, I'm being mocked and laughed at by others, and I live on a diet of bitterness. So Jeremiah, as he often did throughout the book that bears his name, he just pours his soul out to God. And I think it's easy for us to understand why he's doing that because of all the things that we've just read. Look at what they've just gone through. Of course, he's going to talk like this. And yet, amazingly, in the midst of all of his pain and suffering, he finds a pathway to hope. If you look at chapter 3 and verse 21, this I recall to my mind, and therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. Wait a minute. Where is this coming from? How can Jeremiah say, the Lord's loving kindness never ceases? Or your translation makes it, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Really? Look what he just did. How can he say God's compassions never fail? They're new every morning. Really? Well, the answer to that, of course, is that Jeremiah has the right view of things throughout all of this. He understands why all of these bad things have happened. He's been preaching it for 40 years. And so he is able to look to the other side of this, and he affirms that God is still good. Even when God brings upon us these bad things and punishes us, he is still good. But let's ponder this question for a moment. How is it that God is good when he is responsible for all of the bad that's just happened? How could Jeremiah say that God is still good? In what ways is that true?
His judgment is good. His judgment
How?
is righteous.
How?
It's
Well,
righteous.
okay, it's right. His judgment is true and right. Okay, but it's still hard and it's still bad, right? We still don't want it, but your point is right. What else?
How are we good parents when we discipline our children?
Okay, develop that.
Because they're hurting. Depending on what the discipline is, their hearts hurt, their rear ends may hurt. But there's a goal for that. We are correcting them and guiding them in the right path, and in the long run, we rejoice with them.
Okay,
To
good.
ignore a child, Hebrews tells us, parents discipline their children.
Yeah,
Illegitimate children
right.
run wild.
Yeah. Okay, good. So there's a corrective element to the judgment. And God is wanting to change their course and change their direction. All right? So his goodness is seen in that, just like a parent to a child. How else might God's goodness be manifested in this terrible judgment? He sent prophets, right? He sent Jeremiah for 4 decades. It's not like the people didn't have warnings. God was trying to speak to them. And he had other prophets who came long before Jeremiah, right? So the patience of God and the mercy of God is something that we can think about as well. His goodness is seen in that.
And unlike some other nations that were utterly destroyed, God has preserved a remnant, and through that, his other promises will be fulfilled.
Good, good. There's a passage here that I've always loved in chapter 3 and verse 33. For he does not afflict from the heart or grieve the sons of men. God does not enjoy punishing people for their sins. This is Jeremiah's way of saying for God, this hurts me more than it hurts you. Okay? When God brings punishment upon a nation, he doesn't say, oh man, this is so great. I love, babies dying in the streets, and I think this is wonderful. It's not that. He doesn't do this from the heart in the sense that it's not something that he enjoys. He does it from the heart in the sense that I have to do this, right? He has no other choice, but he doesn't relish it and enjoy it.
Amen.
Go ahead.
It just occurred to me though that those of you that are old enough to remember when September 11th, when church attendance after that
Yeah, right.
shot way up.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't last, but when that calamity happened, a lot of people turned to God.
Yeah. That's a great segue. You're in the notes because look at chapter 3 and verse 39. Why should any living mortal or any man offer complaint in view of his sins? Let us examine and probe our ways, and let us return to the Lord. I think there were a lot of people in 2001 who were doing that very thing. It shook them up, and they said, we really need to reevaluate some things, and they started putting the spiritual things in the front again. Chapter 3 we don't have time to do any more, but I think it is the turning point in Jeremiah's personal life. There's so much good that comes from this chapter. I don't think I've got anything else that I just have to get to from this, so we'll stop right there. I'll be at the door passing these out to you. This is all the notes that we went through tonight and more. So grab one of these and you can read through it a little bit later. Thank you.